Hello and welcome back. You are listening to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we are on a mission.
A big one.
A big one. We're taking a stack of history books, biographies, political treatises, and honestly, this stack is heavy enough to be a safety hazard if it were to fall off the desk.
I can confirm that. It is a hefty stack today.
But, absolutely necessary. Yeah. We're going to unpack it all, sift through the noise, and find those absolute nuggets of insight that you need to know.
Because the subject demands it.
He really does. Today we are tackling a giant. We're talking about Edmund Burke. Now, depending on who you ask, he's either this, profound genius or a complete relic.
Or both.
Or both. You might know him as the father of modern conservatism. You may have walked past his statue in Washington, D.C. or London and not given it a second glance. But here's the hook, and this is what really pulled me into the research this week. Burke is a walking, talking paradox.
He really is. He's a figure of just massive contradictions.
Exactly. On the one hand, he's the icon of the right. He's the guy who defended the monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, all the established institutions.
The very image of a traditionalist.
But then you actually look at his record, his speeches, his votes in Parliament, and for the vast majority of his life, he was fighting for causes that look incredibly, liberal.
Even radical for his time, you could say.
Right. He championed the American colonists against the British crown.
A huge deal.
He fought tooth and nail for the rights of Irish Catholics against the Protestant ascendancy.
A cause very close to his heart, for reasons we'll get into.
And he spent years, decades even, trying to impeach a corporate governor for corruption and human rights abuses in India. He hated the slave trade. If you just looked at that list, you'd think, okay, this guy is a classic bleeding heart reformer.
You'd put him squarely on the progressive side of the ledger, no question.
And yet, when the French Revolution comes along in 1789, a revolution that was, screaming liberty, equality, fraternity, a revolution that literally overthrew a King Burke, didn't just hesitate.
No, he didn't just critique it.
He absolutely loathed it. He recoiled in horror. He treated it like a plague, like a virus that was going to destroy civilization.
And that right there is the core tension. That's the riddle we have to solve today.
How can the same man be the best friend of the American Revolution and the mortal enemy of the French Revolution? Was he a hypocrite? Did he just get old and cranky? Or is there actually a coherent philosophy underneath all that noise that explains it?
And I think the answer is a firm yes to that last one. There's absolutely a deeper thread. To understand Burke, you can't just look at him as a politician who flips a coin on issues.
No.
You have to see him as a philosopher who is wrestling with the most fundamental tension in human society, the tension between liberty and order.
Liberty and order. Okay.
Yeah. And I think by the end of this conversation, we're going to see that his answer to that tension is surprisingly and perhaps even uncomfortably relevant to the world we're living in right now.
So our mission today is to decode Edmund Burke, to move past the bronze statue and get to the flesh and blood man. And as a little teaser for later, we are also going to debunk the most famous quote attributed to him.
Ah, yes. The famous one.
You know the one, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil
is for good men to do nothing.
Spoiler alert, he never actually said it. But we will get to what he actually said, which I think is arguably more powerful a bit later on.
It's more specific and more challenging, I'd say.
Agreed. So let's start at the very beginning. Because, when we talk about 18th century British politicians, we picture a very specific type of person.
Born with a silver spoon, probably.
Wealthy, aristocratic, English, probably born in a sprawling manor house. Burke was not that.
Not even close. And honestly, I don't think you can understand a single thing Edmund Burke did or wrote later in life if you don't understand where he started. He was, from day one in London, an outsider.
Let's unpack that. He was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1729.
Correct. And just being Irish in London in the 1700s was already, a bit of a mark against you. There was a lot of prejudice.
Sure.
But the real complexity, the real engine of his thought comes from his family dynamic. It sounds like the setup for a tense family drama.
How so?
Well, his father, Richard Burke, was a successful solicitor and, crucially, a member of the established Church of Ireland, so a Protestant.
Okay, part of the establishment.
Very much so. But his mother, Mary Nagle, came from a respectable but declining family of Catholic gentry, and she was a devout Roman Catholic.
A mixed marriage. In today's world, that's barely a footnote.
Right.
But in 18th century Ireland, that was everything, wasn't it?
It was absolutely massive. You have to remember the context of the penal laws. These were a brutal set of laws designed specifically to suppress and disempower the Catholic majority in Ireland. If you were a Catholic, you were essentially a second-class citizen.
It was systemic.
Completely.
Yeah.
You couldn't vote, you couldn't sit in parliament, you couldn't hold any public office, you couldn't be a lawyer or a judge, you couldn't even own a weapon for self-defense.
I read about one particular law that it really stuck with me. The horse rule.
Ah, yes, the 5-pound horse.
If a Catholic owned a horse, any horse, a Protestant could walk up and offer him 5 pounds for it, and the Catholic had to sell it. It didn't matter if it was a prize stallion worth 100 pounds.
Exactly. It wasn't just about economics. It was a system designed to humiliate, to constantly remind you of your inferior status. It was designed to keep the Catholic population impoverished and powerless.
So Burke grows up in this house, where his father represents the system, the Anglican legal official world, and his mother represents the oppressed majority.
He's living that contradiction every single day. He was raised Anglican. He had to be.
For his career prospects.
For any kind of career at all, his father was pragmatic, but his sister, Juliana, was raised in her mother's faith as a Catholic, and he spent his childhood summers with his mother's family in County Cork, the Nagels, who were Catholic gentry living under these suffocating restrictions.
So he wasn't just reading about oppression in a book.
Not at all. He was seeing it happen to his uncles, his cousins. He was feeling the injustice in his own family. It gave him this lifelong sympathy for the underdog, for the outsider, that most of his English colleagues in Parliament just couldn't comprehend. It was in his bones.
But that same background also put a target on his back for his entire career, didn't it?
A huge target. His enemies used it against him relentlessly.
The rumors. I saw some of the political cartoons from the time. They're vicious. They drew him in Jesuit robes. They called him Edmund the Jesuit, the Irish papist.
It was the standard ugly smear of the day. The accusation was that he was a secret Catholic, a sleeper agent for the Pope, sent to destroy the Protestant Constitution of England from the inside.
And they threw around this claim that he was educated at St. Omer. What was that?
St. Omer was a famous Jesuit seminary in France. It was a shorthand way of saying he was a foreign-trained subversive.
Was there any truth to it at all?
Absolutely none. He went to Trinity College Dublin, which was a bastion of Protestant learning, but the mud stuck because he did sympathize with Catholics. He did fight to repeal the penal laws, and his enemies couldn't imagine any reason for that other than secret allegiance.
They couldn't grasp that he was acting on principle.
Exactly. They couldn't grasp that he had seen firsthand that sometimes the law and justice are two very different things. The penal laws were legal, but they weren't just. And that distinction would shape his entire worldview.
That distinction, legal versus just, that seems to be a theme we're going to see over and over again.
It's central to understanding him.
So he finishes university, and like every ambitious young man with a demanding father, he goes to London to study law at the Middle Temple. His dad must have been thrilled. My son, the barrister.
Oh, absolutely. This was the plan. But then, like so many ambitious young men with demanding fathers, he promptly disappointed him.
He hated the law.
He found it dry, technical, what he called the narrow and contracted practice of the law.
Yeah.
He wanted to deal with big ideas, with literature, with philosophy, with the great questions of human nature. So he just dropped out. He started traveling and writing.
And his dad's reaction?
He cut him off. Cut off his allowance completely. It caused a rift between them that lasted for years. But this period of, being a struggling writer in London is absolutely crucial because this is where we meet Burke, the philosopher. Long before he ever gave a speech in Parliament, he wrote a book on aesthetics.
Right, a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, published in 1757. Now, I have to be honest, when I hear aesthetics, my mind goes to, interior design or art critics. Why does a book about art theory matter for a political deep dive?
It matters immensely because it's a window into his soul. It explains how he viewed the world and, more importantly, how he viewed the state. He divides our powerful emotional experiences into two big categories, the beautiful and the sublime.
Okay, let's define them. What is the beautiful, according to Burke?
The beautiful is all about things that are small, smooth, polished, pleasant. Think of a perfectly formed flower, a delicate piece of music, a well-manicured garden.
So things that are pleasing and safe.
Yes, safe is a good word. They evoke feelings of love and affection. They make you feel relaxed.
And the sublime?
The sublime is the polar opposite. It is vast, it's rugged, it's dark, it's powerful, it's obscure.
So what's an example of that?
Think of a violent storm at sea with massive waves crashing over your ship. Think of standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon and feeling that dizzying sense of scale. Think of a dark forest at night or a towering cathedral.
So it's not scary like a horror movie, but it's overwhelming. It makes you feel small.
It produces awe. And a key part of awe for Burke is a sort of delightful terror. It commands your respect because it is so much bigger and more powerful than you are.
Okay, I think I get the distinction. But what's the political connection?
Here it is. Burke believed that the state, the government, society itself should be sublime.
Wait, the government should be a storm at sea? That sounds terrible.
Not literally, but in the sense that it should be ancient, mysterious, and powerful. It should command our reverence, our awe. He believed that if you look at the state as just a simple machine like a toaster that you can take apart and put back together whenever you want, you lose that reverence.
We'll lose the authority.
You lose the very thing that holds society together. For Burke, society needs its mysteries, its traditions, its grandeur. We need to look at our institutions with a sense of awe, not just as a matter of cold calculation.
That is fascinating. So he's basically an anti-technocrat before technocrats even existed. He doesn't want people just poking the state with a stick to see how it works, because that demystifies it.
Precisely. He thinks if you strip away the mystery and the tradition, what he later calls the drapery of life, you strip away the civility. And he doubled down on this exact fear with a satire he wrote around the same time called A Vindication of Natural Society.
This story is hilarious. He wrote it to mock a specific person, right? A Lord Bolingbroke.
Yes. Bolingbroke was a famous deist and rationalist. He had written these essays arguing for a natural religion. He basically said, hey, let's use our pure reason to strip away all the superstition and revealed truth and all the historical baggage of organized religion and just keep the parts that make logical sense.
But kind of religious minimalism.
Exactly. And Burke thought this was a profoundly dangerous and arrogant idea. So he wrote this pamphlet pretending to be Bolingbroke, or a disciple of Bolingbroke.
And what was his argument in the pamphlet?
He took Bolingbroke's logic and applied it to society. He argued, okay, if we're going to use pure reason to destroy the artificial construct of the church, why not use it to destroy the artificial construct of the state too? Let's get rid of government, laws, marriage, property, social classes. Because if you look at them with cold, abstract logic, they are all unnatural and oppressive.
He was trying to show that this line of thinking, if you take it to its logical conclusion, leads to total anarchy.
It's a classic reductio ad absurdum. He was trying to demonstrate that society is not a simple logic puzzle. But he did such a brilliant job mimicking Bolingbroke's grand rationalist style that people missed the joke.
Laughs. So people thought it was serious.
Completely. Radical thinkers and early anarchists started reading it and saying, yes, this Bolingbroke fellow gets it, down with the government.
That is the ultimate danger of good satire.
It is. Burke actually had to write a new preface for the second edition saying, everybody, please calm down. I'm joking. This is irony. But it shows us that even in his 20s, Burke was deeply, deeply afraid of what happens when you apply abstract, disembodied reason to complex, living, human things like a church or a state.
So we have the philosopher, the satirist, the Irishman. But eventually, the man needs a paycheck. He has to enter the political arena for real.
He does, and he gets his big break when he lands a job as the private secretary to the Marquess of Rockingham.
And Rockingham was a big deal.
A very big deal. He was a major Whig grandee and, for a time, the prime minister. This was Burke's ticket into the inner circle. And in 1765, through Rockingham's patronage, he enters the House of Commons representing a place called Wendover.
Now, Wendover was what they called a pocket borough. For those of us who aren't experts in 18th century electoral peculiarities, what does that mean?
It means the election was basically a sham. Wendover was a tiny, depopulated district that was essentially in the pocket of a wealthy patron, in this case, a Lord Verney.
So Bernie owned the land.
And therefore, he controlled the handful of voters. He literally just pointed at Burke and said, he is your MP, and that was that. No campaigning, no debates, no real voting.
It's just incredibly ironic, isn't it, that one of the greatest thinkers on the nature of representation entered Parliament through a completely undemocratic loophole.
It is. But Burke would have defended it. He would have argued that the system of rotten boroughs, as they were called, had a hidden benefit. It allowed men of immense talent, but no personal wealth like him, to get into Parliament based on the judgment of an experienced patron.
That's an interesting counter-argument. He's saying if every seat was a modern, expensive popularity contest, Only the independently wealthy could afford to run.
That's his point. It allowed for merit to find a way in. And once he was in, he made a splash almost immediately.
A huge splash, from what I've read. William Pitt the Elder, who was like the Zeus of British politics at the time.
A towering figure.
Pitt said Burke's maiden speech stopped the mouths of all Europe. He was an orator of the highest order. He had this incredible command of language and history and philosophy.
And he brings a new and at the time controversial idea to the table. The legitimacy of the political party.
Right. Which is strange to think about because today we tend to hate parties. We see them as divisive, toxic, tribal. But Burke argued they were absolutely essential for a free government. Why?
You have to look at what he was up against. King George III was actively trying to reclaim power that the monarchy had lost over the previous century. He did this by creating an informal group in Parliament called the King's Friends.
A kind of shadow government.
Exactly. They weren't the official ministers of the government, but they operated behind the scenes. They had the king's ear, they controlled royal patronage, and they pulled the strings to undermine the official government if it displeased the king. Burke called it a double cabinet.
So the official government was just a front, and the king was really running things from the shadows.
That was Burke's great fear. He saw it as a slide back toward absolute monarchy. He argued that a single independent MP, acting alone, was powerless against this kind of coordinated secret influence. The king could just buy him off or intimidate him or crush him.
So what was the solution?
Association.
No.
Organization. He wrote a famous pamphlet on this, Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents. And in it he says, when bad men combine, the good must associate.
That's the origin of the good men idea, even if it's not the famous misquote.
This is the real quote. He defined a political party not as a cynical group of people just trying to get power, but as a body of men united for promoting by their joint endeavors the national interest upon some particular principle in which they are all agreed.
So principled opposition.
Principled, organized opposition was the only way to keep a government honest and to check the power of the crown. For him, party divisions, as he said, are inseparable from free government. They are the immune system of democracy.
That's a powerful idea. And it brings us to 1774. Burke levels up. He gets elected to represent Bristol.
And this is the big leagues. Bristol wasn't a pocket borough. It was the second city of England at the time, a massive, bustling trading port with a huge, engaged, and very opinionated electorate. This was a real election.
And this leads to one of the most famous, I think most controversial moments of his entire career, the speech to the electors of Bristol.
Yes, this is where he lays out his theory of representation, what we now call the Trustee Model.
I want to push back on this because when I first read it, it sounded incredibly arrogant.
It usually does to modern ears. There's no getting around that.
So, set the scene. He gets elected. His colleague, the other newly elected MP for Bristol, stands up and gives a speech, and he basically promises, I will do whatever you, the voters, tell me to do. I will be your voice. I will follow your instructions. He takes the delegate approach.
The common sense approach, most people would say.
Right. And then Burke stands up, and he says, essentially, no, I'm not going to do that.
He tells them flat out, I am not your messenger. I am not a weathercock on a steeple to show you which way the wind blows.
But isn't that the whole point of democracy? If I vote for you, I expect you to represent my interests, my voice. If my community wants lower taxes and you go to London and vote to raise them because you think you know better, haven't you betrayed me?
Burke would say no. He would say he betrayed you if he didn't use his own judgment. Here's the key quote, and it's a stunner. Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion.
He betrays you. That is incredibly strong language.
Think of it this way. If you have a serious heart condition and you hire the best surgeon in the country, you don't stand over his shoulder in their operating room and vote on where he should make the cut.
Of course not.
You don't want him to ask the audience, should I cut the artery or the vein? You hired him precisely because he has spent his life studying anatomy and you haven't. You are trusting his judgment.
Okay, so the MP is the expert surgeon of the state.
That's Burke's view. He's in London. He's reading the secret intelligence reports from the colonies. He's debating the nuances of international trade with Ireland. He's seeing the big national picture. The merchant in Bristol, as important as he is primarily worried about his own ledger book.
Right.
Burke argued that Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests. It's a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole. And if an MP just follows the local polls, he isn't governing. He's just pandering.
Logically, I can see the argument. But politically, that sounds like absolute suicide. Do the people of Bristol buy it?
Absolutely not. They hated it.
Of course they did.
Especially because Burke immediately proceeded to use his judgment to do things they despised. He voted to relax trade restrictions with Ireland, which the Bristol merchants saw as a direct threat to their monopoly and their profits.
So he voted against the direct financial interests of his constituents.
He did. He also supported a measure of relief for Catholics. And Bristol was a hotbed of anti-Catholic sentiment. He was completely out of step with public opinion back home.
So he actually walked the walk. He wasn't just theorizing. He voted his conscience against his own voters' wishes because he thought it was right for the empire as a whole.
He absolutely did. And in 1780, he paid the price. He lost his seat. He actually withdrew from the race before the final vote because he knew he was going to get crushed. He sacrificed his career for his principles.
And that integrity brings us to the first major liberal chapter of his legacy, the American crisis. Burke is often cited as a hero by Americans for his stance. But he wasn't calling for independence, was he?
No, and that's a common misconception we need to clear up. Burke was an imperialist through and through. He believed in the British Empire. He wanted to keep it together. But he looked at how the British government under Lord North was treating the American colonies, and he thought it was sheer self-destructive madness.
What was the core of his disagreement? The British government was obsessed with the principle of the thing, the right to tax.
Yes, they were stuck on this abstract legalistic point. We are the sovereign power. Parliament has the right to tax anyone, anywhere in the empire.
And Burke's response to that was?
He basically screams, I don't care about your abstract right. In his great speech on American taxation in 1774, he says, I hate the very sound of metaphysical distinctions. He says the question is not whether you have a right to make your people miserable, but whether it is not your interest to make them happy.
So he's a pragmatist.
A profound pragmatist, he's saying. Stop arguing about what is true in theory and look at what is happening in reality. He says, sure, maybe you have the technical legal right to tax them, but is it wise? Is it prudent? Is it worth blowing up the entire empire over a few pence of tax on tea?
He wanted to turn back the clock, essentially.
Yes, to a time when things worked. He wasn't proposing some radical new system. He was looking to the past for a solution. His answer was to return to the policy of salutary neglect. Basically, leave the Americans alone to tax themselves through their own assemblies, let them prosper, and Britain would prosper from the trade. His plea was leave the Americans as they anciently stood.
Then, in 1775, it's the 11th hour. It's just weeks before the first shots are fired at Lexington and Concord. And he makes this one last, massive, desperate effort for peace. The speech is called Conciliation with America.
And it is one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in the English language. The imagery he uses here is it's breathtaking.
This is the ties argument, right?
It is. He stands up in Parliament and tries to convince them that you cannot hold an empire together by force alone. You can't just send armies and tax collectors. He says, my hold of the colonies is in the close affection which grows from common names, from kindred blood, from similar privileges and equal protection. These are ties which, though light as air, are as strong as links of iron.
Light as air are as strong as links of iron. That is just pure poetry.
It's profound political psychology. He's saying that a shared culture, a shared language, a shared history of liberty, these are stronger bonds than any army you can send across the Atlantic. And then he makes a prophecy, a chillingly accurate one.
What does he predict?
He warns them, he says. Remember who these people are. The Americans are descendants of Englishmen. They inherited that fierce Protestant English spirit of liberty. If you try to force your abstract concept of sovereignty on them, they will cast your sovereignty in your face.
And that is exactly what happened. They threw the tea in the harbor and the sovereignty right back at them.
It is. And he made another really uncomfortable but astute point about slavery. He noted that in the southern colonies where slavery was most prevalent, the white population was even more fiercely attached to their freedom than in the North.
Why was that?
Because, as Burke put it, freedom is to them not only an enjoyment, but a kind of rank and privilege. They saw the stark alternative every single day. They knew exactly what it looked like to be a subject, a slave. So they were hypersensitive to any attempt by Britain to, in their eyes, enslave them. He told Parliament flat out, you cannot argue a whole people into slavery.
But they didn't listen. His resolutions for peace were ignored. The war started. And Burke was. He was despondent.
He was heartbroken. He saw it as a civil war. He couldn't even bring himself to celebrate British victories over the Americans. He felt that the British public who were cheering for the war were showing signs of a deep moral rot. He wrote that the English national character was changing, that people were becoming less fiery and jealous of their own liberty and more authoritarian.
So on America, he's the clear champion of liberty against overbearing power. Now, let's pivot halfway around the world to the East. Because if America was about the abuse of legislative power, India was about the abuse of corporate power.
This is a huge, and I mean huge, part of his life's work that often gets skipped over in the textbooks, but it consumed him for the better part of 2 decades. Burke was obsessed with bringing justice to India.
And we're talking specifically about the East India Company.
The company, yes. And we have to be clear, they weren't just a business selling tea and spices anymore. By this point, they were a de facto government. They controlled the entire province of Bengal. They had a massive private army. And Burke saw them as a rogue state, a vehicle for what he called Indianism, which was his term for unchecked corporate tyranny.
And in this story, he found his ultimate villain in one man, Warren Hastings.
Warren Hastings, the Governor General of Bengal. For Burke, Hastings personified everything that was wrong with British rule in India, and Burke spearheaded the impeachment of Hastings. The trial began in 1788 in Westminster Hall, and it was the trial of the century, a massive public spectacle.
And Burke was the lead prosecutor. From what I've read, he did not hold back with his language.
Oh, not at all. Burke was never one for subtle language when he was morally outraged. I have some of the insults he threw at Hastings here. He called him a captain general of iniquity.
Wow.
He called him a spider of hell, a ravenous vulture devouring the carcasses of the dead.
A spider of hell. You don't hear that in parliamentary debates anymore.
You do not. But the anger was genuine. He wasn't just performing. He had spent years studying the reports coming out of India. He gave this incredible speech on a subject called the Nabob of Arcot's Debts, where he described in horrifying detail the devastation of the Indian infrastructure. He talked about how the company's greed had led to the ruin of ancient reservoirs and water systems, causing famine and death on a massive scale.
So he's painting this picture of a sophisticated, ancient civilization being plundered and destroyed by a bunch of young, greedy British upstarts.
That's exactly it. And this brings us to one of his most important and enduring philosophical contributions, his attack on what he called geographical morality.
Geographical morality, that's a key term. What does he mean by that?
Well, the defense team for Hastings and the company basically argued this. Look, you can't judge us by the gentle standards of British society. This is India. Things are different over there. Despotism is the normal way of doing things in the East. We are just playing by the local rules to survive.
So it's a kind of, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, but applied to tyranny and corruption.
Right. It's the idea that what's immoral in London can be perfectly acceptable in Calcutta. And Burke just erupts at this idea. He says, rubbish. He argues that morality is universal. He says the laws of morality are the same everywhere. If it is wrong to rob and starve and torture people in London, it is just as wrong to rob and starve and torture them in India.
That is a surprisingly modern take.
Yeah.
He's basically arguing for a concept of universal human rights before that was really a codified thing.
He is. He viewed the British Empire as a trust. He believed Britain had a sacred moral duty to govern for the benefit of the subject people. And if the empire wasn't benefiting the Indians, he said it had no right to exist.
So he wasn't an anti-imperialist in the modern sense. He wasn't saying, and the empire, but he was saying the empire must be moral.
Correct. It must be accountable to a higher law. And he applied this thinking to slavery, too. He detested the slave trade. He called it a diabolical practice, a weed that grows in every soil.
And he actually tried to do something about it.
He did. He drafted a detailed plan for the gradual abolition of slavery. Now, we have to be honest here. He was a gradualist. His plan included things like having inspectors and protectors, but it was based on the paternalistic 18th century view that slaves needed to be civilized and prepared for freedom.
So not a radical abolitionist like Wilberforce would later be.
No, but compared to the vast majority of his peers, who saw slaves as nothing more than property, he was miles ahead. He saw their humanity.
Okay, let's look at the scoreboard so far. It's 1788. He has defended the American rebels against the crown. He's defended Irish Catholics against the Protestant elite. He's attacked corporate corruption in India. He hates slavery. If you stop the biography right there, you say Edmund Burke, the great liberal hero. Full stop.
You absolutely would. And the Whigs, the liberal reformist party of the day, they loved him. He was their intellectual heavyweight, their conscience.
And then comes July 14th, 1789. The Bastille is stormed in Paris. The French Revolution begins. The king is stripped of his power. The Declaration of the Rights of Man is published. And the Whigs in London, his friends and colleagues, are popping champagne.
They're ecstatic. They think this is Act Two of the American Revolution, or maybe a French version of Britain's own glorious revolution of 1688. They think, finally, the French are throwing off their tyrant and becoming like us.
But Burke looks at the exact same events, the same speeches, the same riots, the same declarations, and he sees a horror movie. He doesn't cheer. He recoils. Why? What did he see that everyone else missed?
He saw the triumph of abstract theory over concrete reality. And this leads to his most famous and influential work, his masterpiece, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which he published in 1790.
This book just exploded the political landscape, didn't it?
It broke everything. It split his party, it ended his closest friendships, and it laid the foundation for modern conservatism. And the core argument comes down to the difference between abstract rights and what he would call prescriptive or inherited rights.
This is probably the hardest Burkean concept to grasp, but it's the most important.
It is the absolute key.
So let's break it down very carefully. What is an abstract right?
Okay. An abstract right is a right that you deduce from pure reason. Imagine you sit down in a coffee shop today with a blank piece of paper and you write a list of things every human being should have just by virtue of being human. Every human has a right to happiness. Every human has a right to property. Every human has a right to a say in their government.
That's the rights of man.
That's the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. It comes from pure theory. It sounds wonderful. It sounds self-evident.
Who could possibly argue with that?
Burke would. He'd say, that's lovely. It's a nice theory, but what does it mean in practice? He'd ask. Okay, you have a theoretical right to property, but is there a law in your country that actually protects it? Is there a court that will enforce that law? Is there a police force that will arrest the person who violates it? Burke argued that a right doesn't exist just because you can imagine it or write it on a piece of paper.
It only exists if it's real, if it's enforceable.
Yes, if it has been woven into the actual fabric of a specific society over a long period of time, which is why he preferred what he called the rights of Englishmen.
So rights as an inheritance, not a theory.
Precisely. Think of your rights like a house. You don't just conjure a beautiful house out of thin air based on a perfect architectural drawing. You inherit a real house from your grandfather who built the solid foundation. Your father added a new room. You come along and you fix the leaky roof. You have the right to trial by jury in England, not because all humans have it in the abstract, but because Englishmen fought and died for it in the Magna Carta and defended it in 1688, and it was handed down to you as a specific, concrete inheritance.
It's an heirloom, not just an idea.
It's a precious heirloom, and because it's an heirloom, you treat it with respect. You don't take a sledgehammer to the whole house just because the floorboards squeak. You carefully fix the floorboards. Burke saw the French revolutionaries taking a slave hammer to their entire history, the church, the calendar, the monarchy, the nobility, thinking they could just design a better country from scratch on a blank piece of paper.
And that terrified him.
It terrified him because he believed that human society is infinitely more complex than any one generation, let alone one group of philosophers, can possibly understand. This leads to his most profound statement on the nature of society. He wrote that society is a partnership.
Oh, this quote is incredible.
A partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born.
That is such a heavy concept. It's a contract across time. If you destroy your institutions, you are stealing from your ancestors and you are cheating your descendants.
Yes, you're breaking the chain. This is why he defended these institutions, the pleasing illusions and the drapery of life. He admitted that logically a king is just a man, a queen is just a woman. But if you strip away all the pomp, the ceremony, the traditions that make power gentle and legitimate, you are left with nothing but naked, brutal power.
And naked power is ugly. This leads us to that famous and very controversial Marie Antoinette passage.
Oh, this is the part of the book that drew the most fire then and now. He recounts seeing the Queen of France years before as a young princess, and he describes her as a delightful vision, like a morning star. And he laments her fall from grace, her humiliation by the mob.
And then he writes that iconic line.
He writes, But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever.
Sophisters, economists, and calculators.
Yeah.
He is basically predicting the rise of the cold, rational, technocratic mindset. But this passage got him absolutely roasted, didn't it?
Massive, massive backlash. Thomas Paine wrote his book, Rights of Man, specifically as a blistering rebuttal to Burke, and Mary Wollstonecraft, the great feminist thinker, wrote a vindication of the rights of men.
And Paine had that absolutely biting line about Burke.
He did. He said Burke pities the plumage, but forgets the dying bird.
Ouch. The meaning being that Burke is crying over the Queen's fancy clothes and her lost dignity while completely ignoring the French peasants who were starving to death under the old regime.
And it was a fair critique in some ways. Burke was romanticizing a deeply flawed and unjust system. But Burke's deeper point wasn't that the old regime was perfect. His point was that if you tear down the plumage, the culture, the manners, the religion, the traditions that soften power, you don't get a healthy free bird. You get a vulture. You get the guillotine.
And he was right about the violence. He predicted the Reign of Terror years before it happened.
He was. He saw that once you destroy traditional authority, the things people obey out of habit, affection, and respect, the only thing left to make people obey is naked force, terror.
And this issue, this book, it just split the Whig Party in two. It destroyed his closest friendships, most famously his friendship with Charles James Fox.
That moment is one of the great tragedies of British political history. Fox and Burke were the closest of friends and political allies for decades. But Fox was a romantic, and he loved the French Revolution.
And this led to a final public break in Parliament.
It did. In a debate in 1791, Fox gave a speech praising the new French Constitution. Burke then stood up and delivered a furious condemnation of it. As he spoke, Fox, who was sitting next to him, leaned over and whispered, "There is no loss of friendship."
And Burke's reply?
Burke replied, loud enough for the whole House of Commons to hear, "I regret to say there is. I have done my duty, though I have lost my friend. There is a loss of friends. I know the price of my conduct."
Fox actually wept in his seat.
He did. Tears were seen rolling down his cheeks. It was the end of an era, the end of a great political partnership. But Burke felt he had no choice. He was convinced that French ideas were a contagion that would destroy Britain if they weren't stopped.
He became almost a man possessed by this idea, which leads to the dramatic dagger scene.
Oh, yes. This is pure political theater. It's 1792. Burke is giving a speech on the dangers of French agents in Britain. He claims that thousands of daggers have been ordered from the city of Birmingham to be used by French revolutionaries. And to prove his point, he reaches into his coat, whips out a real dagger, and throws it onto the floor of the House of Commons.
A literal mic drop, but with a weapon.
It clattered on the floorboards, and he shouted, "This is what you are to gain by an alliance with France. This is the fraternity they offer you."
That is just intense. Some of his old friends thought he was going mad, right? That he'd lost his mind.
They did. They thought he'd become a paranoid, unhinged reactionary, but his predictions just kept coming true. He didn't just predict the guillotine, he predicted Napoleon.
How do you do that?
In the Reflections, he wrote that as the revolution descended into chaos, the French assembly would eventually lose control to its own army. And he said that some popular general who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery shall become the master of your whole republic.
Which is exactly what happened with Napoleon Bonaparte a few years later.
And even deeper than that, you could argue that Burke was the first person to describe the modern totalitarian state.
How so?
He saw that the new French state wasn't just changing the government, it was trying to change everything. They changed the calendar, they abolished the old provinces, they tried to create a new state religion, they changed the names of the months, they policed the way people spoke. He wrote in his later letters that this new state had dominion and conquest for its sole object's dominion, over minds by proselytism, over bodies by arms.
He saw that a state based on a pure abstract ideology recognizes no limits. It has to control your mind. That sounds terrifyingly like the 20th century.
It connects directly to the horrors of the 20th century. That's why Burke is still read. He warned us 200 years in advance about what happens when you try to create a perfect utopia by tearing up all the roots of an existing society.
So Burke spends his final years as this sort of prophet of doom, shouting about the dangers from France. But his personal life was crumbling at the same time.
It was incredibly tragic. He retired from Parliament in 1794, right after the Hastings trial finally ended. He had hoped that his son, Richard, would take his seat in Parliament and carry on his work. Richard was his pride and joy, the center of his universe.
But it wasn't to be.
No. Richard died suddenly of tuberculosis that same year, and Burke was utterly devastated.
He was broken by it.
Completely broken. He described himself as an old oak torn up by the roots. He said the world was now a blank to him. Without his son, he felt he had no future to leave behind.
But even in his grief, he could still fight. He wrote one last great piece, The Letter to a Noble Lord, in 1796. This was a ferocious clapback, wasn't it?
A massive, righteous clapback. The Duke of Bedford, a young, super-rich aristocrat who sympathized with the French Revolution, had attacked Burke in the House of Lords for accepting a government pension. He basically said, why is this old commoner getting money from the taxpayers?
Which is pretty rich, coming from a duke whose entire fortune was inherited.
Exactly, and Burke just tears him apart. He contrasts his own life of hard work and public service, his earned pension, with the Duke's unearned inherited privilege. And he reminds the Duke, with devastating historical detail, that the vast wealth of the Bedford family came directly from King Henry VIII looting the Catholic Church during the Reformation.
So he's saying, don't you dare talk to me about where money comes from. Your entire fortune is founded on an act of revolutionary plunder.
And then he delivers the killer blow. He warns the Duke. The French revolutionaries you are flirting with, they don't care about your liberal ideas. They will treat you and your property just like they treated the French nobility. They will chop you up. He calls the revolutionaries the minters of coin, who will happily melt down the Duke's coronet without a second thought.
Burke, the commoner, defending his own merit against an aristocrat. It shows again that he wasn't a blind defender of the rich. He was a defender of order, but he believed in earned worth.
And he believed in free markets, too. We haven't touched on that much, but it's an important part of his thought. Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism, apparently said that Burke was the only man he knew who thought exactly as he did on economics without any prior communication.
And Burke wrote a piece on this, Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, in 1795.
Yes, during a terrible famine. And while others were calling for government price controls and wage fixing, Burke argued against it. He believed in the natural price of the market and that government interference would only make the scarcity worse. So economically, you could call him a classical liberal.
Okay, before we get to the end of his life and sum it all up, we have to do the debunking, the quote. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
It's a fantastic quote. It's powerful, it's memorable, it's on mugs, t-shirts, inspirational posters.
But Edmund Burke never wrote it.
He did not. It appears nowhere in his collected works.
So where does it come from? How did it get attached to him?
It's a mutation. It's an evolution of an idea he did express. The closest thing he actually wrote was way back in Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, back in 1770 when he was arguing for political parties. He wrote, "When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle."
When bad men combine, the good must associate. It carries the same core meaning, that you need collective action to stop evil, but the phrasing is different. It's more specific.
It is. It's about organization, not just individual inaction. And the good men do nothing version probably evolved over the 19th and 20th centuries, getting punchier and more memorable with every misquotation, until it stuck to Burke, who seemed like the most likely author. But the sentiment is pure Burke. Evil is organized, therefore good must be organized too.
Burke died in 1797, likely of stomach cancer, and he was buried in Beaconsfield in an unmarked grave at his own request.
Which is a telling detail. He did that to avoid his grave being desecrated by French Jacobins if they ever invaded England. He was genuinely terrified right up to the end that the revolution was coming for him.
He died fearing the world he knew was ending. He didn't live to see that his ideas would eventually help steel Britain's resolve against Napoleon and stabilize Europe for a century.
He died in the dark, not knowing his own legacy.
So let's bring it all home. We started with the paradox. The liberal conservative. The man who supported one revolution and condemned another. How do we sum this up? How do we solve the riddle?
I think the key, the one consistent thread through his entire life, is this. Burke hated the abuse of power. Simple as that. Whether that abuse came from a king and his government in America, a powerful corporation in India, or a revolutionary mob in France.
That's a great way to frame it. The source of the threat changed, but his principle didn't.
Exactly. In America and India, he defended liberty because established power was crushing it. In France, he defended order and tradition because a new ideological power was crushing them. He believed that liberty is only possible when it is rooted in tradition, order, and self-restraint. If you have liberty without order, you just have chaos. And chaos, for Burke, always, always leads to tyranny.
He's the guy who's constantly saying, be careful, don't tear down the fence until you know exactly why it was put up in the first place.
That is the absolute essence of Burkean conservatism. It's not about never changing. He believed a state that cannot change cannot preserve itself. It's about changing carefully, reforming in order to preserve, not innovating in order to destroy.
I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, one that struck me while reading his defense of prejudice. Now, in our modern world, prejudice is one of the worst words we can use. It means bigotry.
Right, it has a purely negative connotation for us.
But Burke used it in its original literal sense as a prejudgment. He saw it as the wisdom inherent in our habits, our gut feelings, our traditions.
Yes. He has this amazing line, "Prejudice renders a man's virtue his habit." It means you don't have to wake up every morning and calculate every moral decision from scratch, using pure reason. You rely on the bank and capital of nations and of ages. You rely on the stored wisdom of your culture.
And that's the provocative question for us today, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We live in a world that loves to deconstruct everything. We question every tradition, every institution, every norm. We're encouraged to start from first principles on everything from gender to government to economics.
And Burke's ghost is standing over our shoulder, asking a very unsettling question. Are you smart enough for that? Do we, as individuals, really have enough intellectual capital to run an entire civilization on our own private stock of reason?
Or do we need the store wisdom of the past, even the parts we don't fully understand or can't logically justify, to keep us from falling off the cliff?
It's a deep and challenging question. Are we standing on the shoulders of giants, or are we busy chopping them down at the knees? Burke would have had a very clear answer.
A question worth chewing on. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into Edmund Burke. We hope you view those statues a little differently now.
And maybe read the reflections. It's difficult, but it's worth the effort.
Until next time, keep diving deep.